Good morning, everybody. My name is Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And I am delighted to welcome you all to this webinar on the recent plebiscite in Mexico. I'm delighted to introduce you the panelists for this morning. Let me introduce first Kate Broom. She is a political scientist. She is the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Thank you, Kate, for joining us. You're a regular in our programs, and I'm delighted that someone in the system, a key political scientist in the system, joined us for this webinar about this very important referendum that Mexico held last Sunday. Thank you, Kate. And let me introduce to you as well Javier Tello. Javier Tello is currently a fellow at the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies. He's a Mexican analyst. You know him. He's here in UCSD writing a book about the ideology of AMLO, of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. It's a bit more complicated than that, but it's about ideology, about Andrés López Obrador vision. And I'm delighted to have you here, Javier. And also, very shortly, Blanca Heredia from CDC will join us. Blanca is having some problems in connecting to the webinar, but she'll be with us shortly. And you know, Blanca is a professor and researcher at the Centro de Docencia Económica, el CIDE, in Mexico City, and she's been doing a lot of research about education lately, and she's a fine political scientist. And at some point of time, she and I will work together at the time, and I have the wonderful memories with Blanca Heredia. So let me start with you, Kate. Could you tell us what was the referendum all about? Could you tell us, and here is Blanca. Blanca, I already introduced you. Welcome. I was explaining the public that you were having some connecting issues, but she's here. Let me, we want to do this as interactive as possible. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So please send us questions, and I will ask the panelists, Javier, Kate, and Blanca, to answer your questions. But feel free to interact with us, and you'll see me. I'm going to be teaching the questions to Blanca, to Javier, and to Kate. So use, please, the Q&A button. So Kate, let's start with you. So what was the purpose of this referendum? And welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much for inviting me. The stated purpose of the referendum was a proposal by the president to bring to trial, or to investigate and then perhaps bring to trial, the 5 living ex-presidents of Mexico, in the name of justice for the victims and the damage that these 5 presidents allegedly did to Mexico. The Supreme Court then ruled that they could not name the 5 ex-presidents, and rewrote the proposal so that it became a vague statement about bringing to justice people who have done bad things to Mexico, which satisfied nobody. The president and his party wanted to focus this as a referendum on the ex-presidents, and the opposition argued that this was too vague. Nobody knew what it meant, and therefore it should not even be attempted. Now, we will, I'm sure, get to discussing what the real purpose of this referendum might have been in AMLO's view, given that, as I understand it, legally speaking, if someone in Mexico has committed a crime, president or not, you can still bring them to trial without a referendum. So I look forward to hearing our discussion about what AMLO was really up to when he made this proposal. I have my own suspicions, but we'll talk about this, I'm sure.
Thank you, Kate. Javier, let's go with you. Could you tell us, I mean, in your mind, what was the purpose of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in organizing this referendum? Could you unmute yourself, Javier? Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Rafael, for inviting me to this webinar. Kate, hello. Blanca, hello. As Kate rightly said, it's very clear what the explicit purpose was of this specific referendum. But clearly, López Obrador had other objectives in mind. And I would argue Morena, as a separate entity from López Obrador, also had its own specific objectives. I think as far as López Obrador is concerned, I think the referendum is part of a bigger, broader project, political project, and also part of a bigger, broader political electoral strategy. As far as the project is concerned, it has to do with direct democracy. It has to do with leadership democracy or populism as well, where it is important for the leader to connect directly with the people. So referendums in general are key tools for that style of leadership, that type of democracy. It also has to do with an electoral strategy going forward, in the sense that as he started in 2018, December 2018, the promise was, we're not doing very well, but we will do well over the next 6 years. After 2 years of not doing very well, I think his message has changed slightly, and now it is, we're not doing very well now, but we were doing even worse before. So it is very important for him to emphasize the errors of the past, the corruption of the past. Everything bad is in the past, and the promise of leaving the past behind and changing in some way. So the referendum also, I guess, captures that. It captures the errors of the past, the corruption of the past, and it is also a message of anti-elitism. You can't get more elite than ex-presidents, I guess. So it is also part of the message that the past was the way it was, bad, because there was a corrupt elite in power, a corrupt elite colluded with the oligarchy, and the referendum is a message that has to change. That is López Obrador, I think, broader objective. And then Morena, I think, was a question of being able to mobilize. How well, how many voters could they get out any given Sunday without the president being on the ballot, without the president helping much. The question here, it's not clear whether it was a test for the leadership of Morena or for Morena in general. It seems to me that most people have read it as a test for the leadership, the current leadership of Morena, Mario Delgado, rather than for Morena in general. But I would argue that those are the sort of broader objectives beyond the specific issue of past corruption by presidents.
Thank you, Javier. Blanca, I'm thrilled to have you here. And what is your take on the goal of the referendum? Could you mute yourself, Blanca?
Yes, I'm thrilled too. Thank you very much for the invitation. Very happy to see you, Kate. Long time. Javier, thank you. I mean, very nice to be here in this panel. Well, I think Javier put it very well, both in terms of a style of leadership and the connection with the direct connection between the leader and the people, and then this broader message of the past. I would just perhaps add that it's part of the foundational narrative of Andrés Manuel López Obrador to argue that given that Mexico had suffered such terrible governments under what he calls neoliberalism generally, that his candidacy in 2018 and his whole project of idea of becoming president had to do with reverting the state of affairs, the terrible state of affairs that those 5 presidents had produced. So it's part of the central narrative that I believe allowed Andrés Manuel López Obrador to win in a landslide victory, in a very important victory in 2018 Mexico's presidency. In terms of what actually happened on Sunday, in terms of popular participation, I think that in the end, several things combined to make it a very poor showing for the first use of the referendum as a method of direct democracy in our constitutional order. This is the first time that Mexico uses it as a way to garner the opinion of Mexican citizens in relation to a particular issue. And clearly the question, the convoluted way in which it was presented did not help anybody understand exactly what one was voting for. The attitude of the president himself was also not very helpful. He started off, since his candidacy, his campaign, he said he wanted to do this referendum, but at the same time, very early on, said that he did not agree with taking these presidents to trial. Then he said that he really did not want to take them to trial, but at the same time, then he sent to Congress the proposal to actually do the referendum with a particular phrasing of the question that, as Kate mentioned, was altered and modified by the Supreme Court because it mentioned the names of the ex-presidents. The way the question was formulated had a lot to do with a judicial power and a Supreme Court that feel, in my view, are in a very complicated position vis-a-vis a very, very strong president. And that if they don't do what he wants, the menace of paying a very big cost is very, very high. And so they did this kind of very complicated move of trying to say, okay, yes, we'll go with the president's referendum, this referendum that on the other hand, he says that he doesn't want, but we'll modify the question so that it is constitutionally sound. But then this thing ended up being nothing. So in a way, I think one of the only things that we got out of this is that the judiciary was able to retain at least its autonomy and its present form, but at a very important cost in terms of the question and therefore what we saw on Sunday in terms of popular participation and just a general sense of what is this about. I think the opposition was quite successful given all of the above, that to present this as a farce and as it being moved by some ulterior motive, in many ways just kind of just keeping Andrés Manuel López Obrador top of mind, keeping his idea that all of Mexico's ills come from the past and he's the solution to all of those problems that come from the past. But I would argue then that the main cost of all of this process was the fact that we started off not with the best foot with the use of this instrument, the referendum, and at the same time, part of the reason it didn't go well had to do with the attempt of the Supreme Court and the judiciary generally to save itself.
Thank you, Blanca.
Got a couple of quick points to there.
Yes, Kate, please.
I think Blanca is right. During the campaign, AMLO repeatedly said, "Mi fuerte no es la venganza," that he wasn't going to do this, that he wasn't going to prosecute, that he was going to leave the past in the past. And now he needs a justification to go back on that. But I also am very concerned about the way that this process developed in terms of its effect on the INE. They did not authorize additional funding for the INE to hold this referendum, which meant that the INE scaled back the number of casillas that it was going to be able to offer and only allowed 2 weeks for the promotional campaign, which is now being used against them as evidence on the part of the president, according to the president, that they were unenthusiastic and deliberately undermined it. So I do wonder a little bit about whether the way that this was held was in fact a rigged test for the IFE, or for the INE, excuse me, I'm old.
Thank you, Kate. I have quite a few questions here, and I remind everybody that you could send your questions in the Q&A bottom. Jose Galicot, a good friend of ours, the leader of Tijuana Innovador, is asking us, Javier and Kate and Blanca, given the results, what it means for the political parties, and what is your take on the results? We know that only about 7%, a little above 7% of the population vote. So what this represents for the political parties, what this represents for AMLO. Kate, would you like to start, or you, Javier?
Sure. I'll say a few words and then ask Javier to pick it up there. I think that to the extent that this was a test for Morena, Morena failed. Even in states governed by Morena, there was a relatively poor turnout. I think that the maximum was somewhere a little over 11%. They made an effort to message that this was about the ex-presidents and nobody cared. Even Morenistas didn't really care all that much. I think that the opposition parties, therefore, are the ones who benefited the most from this. Now, did this stop the idea of show trials? No. There's now this proposal to go ahead and form a Tribunal del Pueblo or Tribunal de los Pueblos to try to bring some facts to light. But I think that the opposition showed that Morena is not able to mobilize the entire population in the way that they seem to have done in the past.
Thank you, Kate. Javier, 6-7 million people, is it too much, too little people? Could you mute yourself, Javier?
All sorts of possible points of reference when you talk about number of people voting. The necessary threshold for it to become a binding referendum, which was 40%, which is absurdly high. No way was that going to be reached ever under any circumstances. The votes that Morena obtained in recent midterm elections is another reference point. The votes obtained by Morena in 2018 is another reference point. The number of people that voted on the referendum about the Texcoco airport is another possible referendum. The number of votes obtained by the PRI in 2018 is another point of reference. So depending on the points of reference, you'll get a sense of whether it is a lot of votes, not that many votes, etc., etc. But I think from the perspective of the voters, of the citizens, there is a sort of paradox here. I think Blanca quite rightly said that corruption was central to the narrative that López Obrador offered in 2018 and is still offering today. So given the centrality of that narrative, given the importance of the issue, I think if you ask most Mexicans, is corruption a problem? How big a problem? Are you concerned about corruption? Would you like that to change, etc., etc.? Everybody would say, yes, it's a problem. Yes, we would like that to change. So it's a key issue for the population. It's a key issue for the president. It's a key issue recognized by all parties. Yet nobody went out and voted. So I think López Obrador, Morena, and the opposition really need to understand why that happened. It's not as if the issue is not relevant. Was it a problem with the question? Was it the fact that, as the opposition argued, the people were not fooled by this farce? Was the problem, as Morena argues, that the INE sabotaged the whole thing? Was the problem the question, a mix of all these things? Are people concerned about corruption but simply are resigned to the fact of corruption? I think the parties, all the parties, Morena included, need to understand why such a big, important issue for everybody didn't bring out people to vote. As far as Morena is concerned, I agree with Kate that they failed, but I think the spin, at least within Morena, is whether Morena failed or whether Mario Delgado, the current leader of Morena, failed. And there's a lot of people within Morena that argue that the person that failed was Mario Delgado and not Morena, and certainly not López Obrador, of course. As far as the opposition is concerned, they had a tricky task. They couldn't, the ex-presidents on trial are their ex-presidents, right? Pena Nieto, Fox, Calderón. So in theory, they should have defended them, but they couldn't possibly do that. But they also couldn't attack them, obviously because they're their ex-presidents. So the only way out for them was to argue that it was a farce. And that's what they did, and successfully so. And the only way that they could prove that it was a farce was if there was a low turnout. So they're really happy. But it is a victory of a very particular battle, the battle of this specific referendum. They did not win, and they have not won, and they don't have an answer for the big corruption issue and past corruption of which they are a part. And they need to develop a counter-narrative to López Obrador's narrative of past corruption going forward into the 2024 election. So yes, they won this particular battle arguing that it was a farce, But you can't argue that corruption is a farce, that the problem of corruption is a circus organized by López Obrador to distract from other important issues. That's just not going to fly. So they won this particular battle, but going forward, they have a problem. And then it's interesting that Movimiento Ciudadano, who is playing this third way strategy, also used the referendum to persevere with this strategy of trying to find a third way. So they are pushing for this truth commission, which is a third way. It's not the farce proposed by Morena, but it's not also ignoring the past, as you could claim that the opposition, PRI, PAN, and PRD are doing. And a sort of middle way, a third way is a truth commission. And I think that they've opted for that third way, which I think is interesting.
Thank you, Javier. Blanca, there's a lot of questions. Cecilia Farfan, one of our fellows, is asking us, what about the timing of the referendum? She believes that it was very poorly timed. The time was not very good because it was just right after the midterm election. But what is your take, Blanca, on the turnout on the referendum, at the day of the referendum?
Well, first on the timing, as you all perhaps are aware, the president and his party had proposed that it be held simultaneously with the midterm elections, and the opposition blocked this possibility, and that's why they picked this Sunday, and that, of course, generated additional constraints and additional kind of disincentives or complications for voters. In addition to the question, there's, I think, many reasons that explain a relatively low turnout, though I fully agree with Javier that how you evaluate how big or low or was the turnout has everything to do with what's your benchmark, what's your reference point. And I think that more generally, if we think in terms of all of the obstacles faced by the referendum, a showing of 7 million is not that bad. I mean, if the president is telling you, even those that would be most willing to go to vote, and a few days before, in one of the mañaneras, he says, well, I'm not going to vote. I'm not going to go to the consulta. And the next day he says, well, I'm going to vote for the no in the consulta. I mean, even the leader in his direct relationship with the people is giving them like these messages that are very incoherent. In addition, you have this fact that, only a few weeks after the midterm elections, you have another electoral process. Then you have this horribly convoluted question. Then you have the opposition very successfully, as both Javier and I have said, argued for it. This is just a farce. So in that context, that despite it all, against all odds, with this impossible question, nobody, in addition to that, nobody knowing what would happen if for some miracle 40% of the voters voted in the referendum and then it became mandatory. What does mandatory means? It also was not clear what would have been the consequence, political, juridical, etc. Given all of that, perhaps it's not that bad of a showing. I think it does show us, I mean, mostly I would say, I haven't done a very deep analysis. I haven't seen, exit polls that would allow us to know a bit more about who these voters were. But my general sense is that these are voters that are quite, feel close to Morena and the president. It's like del voto duro, duro, duro de Morena. And that's interesting. I think that the Morena, the party and the government, but Morena specifically, did a terrible job in terms of the framing, in terms of the communication, in terms of the mobilization. Even against all of these odds, they really, I think, did a terrible job. And how much is Mario Delgado and how much is the party? I don't know. It's very difficult with such an entity that lacks so much like basic rules of operation, like standard operating procedures. It's very difficult to know. Under those conditions, leadership tends to be personal. The personal leaders tends to be extremely important. But I think I really think that they should be studying this process and learning, especially for next year for them. revocación de mandato referendum.
Thank you, Blanca. Kate, would you say that former presidents are safer now after this result?
I think some of the factors that we have all talked about focusing attention on the past and not on López Obrador's mismanagement of the COVID crisis or the economy, although the economy seems to be doing a bit better in the last quarter. I think that those motives remain, and that there will probably be some efforts to either a truth commission or some kind of popular discussion of what have they done. It's unclear to me whether any of what they have done is actually legally actionable or ever was legally actionable. Because if it were, you would not have needed a referendum to go after them. So I don't think their reputations are safe, but it would surprise me to find that they are ending up in prison.
What is your take on this, Javier?
I think the first thing to note is that in 2018, when López Obrador said very publicly during the campaign that he was not interested in past corruption, that he was not a man seeking vengeance, that he was somebody who was going to look forward and was not going to delve into the past. That was a very pragmatic decision, not a principled decision, I would argue. And he took that decision hoping that his project would work and would deliver results. After the first 2 years, given the poor results, I think he's changed his mind, and I think he's going to go after the past. The question is whether he's going to go after the past only at a rhetorical level for electoral purposes, or whether we will see some action at the judicial level. I think he needs some action, and probably some action at the judicial level for the electoral strategy to work. So even if he's doing all this for electoral purposes, he needs some action. The problem there is that for the electoral strategy to work and the sort of action that he needs, it's really against one man rather than ex-presidents. It's Pena Nieto. However much he might hate Calderón, he's the one to go after if you want some action and you can only focus your action on one person and you want to do it partly or mostly for electoral purposes. Pena Nieto is the guy to go after. The problem there is that some people argue that there is a pact, an impunity pact between López Obrador and Pena Nieto. I have no idea if there is one. I'm slightly skeptical, at least of an explicit two-part pact between the two of them. But if that is real, then he would have to break that pact. And obviously, that's an easy pact to break, right? Nobody will stand up and defend Pena Nieto and accuse you for going after Pena Nieto. The question then becomes, at what cost for López Obrador and Morena? We've seen a few videos come out of the Green Party giving cash to the president's brother, etc. The question is, how will Pena Nieto defend himself if they go after him aggressively? Whether he has evidence to expose corruption on Morena's part. And the other problem that López Obrador faces if he goes after Pena Nieto is the fact that he is trying to court the PRI or part of the PRI as he goes forward if he attempts any sort of legal changes, constitutional changes. So obviously they're not going to like López Obrador if he goes after Pena Nieto. They might reach an agreement. I mean, the PRI is well known for sacrificing ex-presidents for their own sake or the sake of the party. So it's not as if it's an impossible deal. And obviously there's the possibility of individual deals with individual PRI members, but that's another issue that López Obrador has to look into. But I would argue, as Kate quite right pointed out, that certainly their reputation is not safe. And I would argue that all of them are pretty safe, except perhaps Pena Nieto, because he's the one to go after. We're going to win 2024.
Blanca, how do you feel about Pena Nieto? Would you agree with Javier that he's the one who's going to be looked after?
I think that I agree with Javier that he's the most likely to be, put on trial for good and bad reasons, let me put it that way, or for good and principled and pragmatic reasons, or electoral reasons. I see Javier's point as to, especially if results of this government are not as good as they expect, and as one would expect, they continue to not be as good as they might have expected. Well, the need to put the past on trial might become increasingly attractive or even necessary. The fact, however, that Andres Manuel at the beginning of 2008, and even I think to this point, tends to be more pragmatic in relation to this issue, is that in fact, putting Pena Nieto on trial is complicated. It has a cost, an important cost in terms of potential stability, and also sort of the governing arrangements that allow AMLO's government to work. We saw it in the last intermediate elections. Many, I think, of the victories of Morena in several federal entities had probably a lot to do with priista or ex-priista structures. And that is not irrelevant. So in addition to the things that Javier mentioned about, the scarcity value of PRI having gone up after June 6th, especially in terms of bringing about constitutional reforms, and even some other just legal reforms, because clearly in terms of Congress, Morena suffered some losses, and its ability to dictate the agenda was diminished, and the PRI there gains a lot. And so going after Peña is, I think, for good reasons for the president since 2018, but even today, and perhaps even more so, has a very important cost, and he has to balance that vis-a-vis the potential electoral gain. One of the things that I sort of felt that would have been interesting, at least as an exercise in terms of the referendum, is to why was there no real attempt to frame it in terms of transitional justice? I mean, and to put squarely in the center of the discussion the principled versus pragmatic question about how you deal with crimes of the past and how you deal with this matter. And we know that many countries, when they did their transitions to democracy and had to face this question, acted pragmatically, right? Argentina, South Africa, Spain. They decided that all of those crimes from the past were best left alone, because if you tried to bring them to trial, though, that could, threaten the possibility of the future, of building a different future. And it seems to me that the kinds of crimes which involve very critically corruption, but a whole system of having, a small elite take most of the pie, and also, all of violence and the death, there's heinous crimes that would, from a principled perspective, need to be judged. And but at the same time, there is a cost in terms of stability and governability, and in terms of the possibility of building a better future, that I'm simply, felt that I don't quite understand why it was never part of the narrative of having to do with the referendum itself, why that framing was not at all important. And one indication of this, there was no campaign for the no. There was a big campaign for the no referendum, don't go to vote, but there was no campaign for, let the past sleep for the future to blossom, kind of.
Thank you, Blanca. I have several questions. Michael Letieri, who is a fellow here at the center, he asked, how politically useful or necessary is to prosecute ex-presidents when there are several ex and current governors all from the opposition, who are more easier targets. And then Lorena Lopez Powers, she asks us, does this type of action impact Mexico's standing in the world? And Kate, you've been an acute observer of the Mexican left. What is your take on Morena? I mean, it's 2024, it's coming, and is Morena becoming a real political party? What type of political party are we having with Morena? What's your take on this?
I don't think it's a real political party. I think it's probably several political parties in embryo. They have not figured out how to get along together. They have been unable to elect new leadership. They have been unable to select candidates without major internal controversies, without the influence of López Obrador publicly stating these are the guys, and he can't really do that without tarnishing his democratic credentials. So I think that Morena is not in good shape as a political party, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't win, because the opposition is also not in good shape. And they had to join together three very distinct political parties in order to stop AMLO from getting another supermajority in the Congress in the last elections. And let's not forget that Morena now governs over half of the states. Now, why did Morena do so well in the gubernatorial elections when it lost seats in the congressional elections has something to do with voters being just really turned off by the powers in charge. So they just turned out incumbent governors. And Morena happened to be there to pick up those pieces. That does not necessarily mean that Morena was a very effective party campaigning, or that people really understood what Morena stood for in those different states. So I think that that Morena has a lot of work to do to develop itself as a real political party, but that may not be necessary to win in 2024.
Thank you, Kate. Javier, any reaction to the governors? I mean, they will be easy targets of put them into trial. Any reaction on that? And would you like to say something about Morena? What is your take on Morena as a party?
Let me start with Morena. I basically agree with what Kate said. I think Morena was a movement that became a political movement, that became an electoral machine that won. And it then had to become institutionalized. The problem there is that given AMLO's style of leadership democracy, populist style, it was unlikely to become institutionalized, because that's not what that type of leader wants and needs, a formal political party. They do better with a movement. The more Morena became institutionalized, the more power Morena would have, and the less power López Obrador would have. But if it did so, there was an incentive for it not to become institutionalized from López Obrador's perspective. At the same time, if it doesn't become institutionalized, it's not going to do well in elections. So it needs to become institutionalized. So López Obrador has been trapped within that, I think, dilemma. He doesn't want it to become institutionalized because he loses power, but he needs it to become institutionalized if he wants to win elections. So he's been trapped there, and I think Morena is in trouble in that respect. The fact that the opposition is in greater trouble certainly helps Morena, but it doesn't solve Morena's internal problems. As far as the governors, they're just not enough, right? There's already a few governors, and there's always been governors behind bars, and it's just not enough at this point. And let me paint a scenario. Let's assume that it's 2024 and that on average Mexico's growth has been 1.4 or 1.3 over the 6 years, okay? Well below the famous neoliberal average. And let's assume that violence remains pretty much where it is. It becomes stabilized. But Pena Nieto is behind bars. Does Morena win the election? I mean, I think it would, personally. So very little growth, or growth well below past 30 years. And as a result, probably greater poverty, greater inequality. and the same sort of violence as we had in 2018 when this government started, which is above the level that it was when it assumed power, but not greater, at a greater level. It sort of stabilizes. So even if it goes down a little bit, but not very much. But again, Pena Nieto behind bars. So I think that's the incentive. And as Blanca pointed out, obviously the problem there is not that there isn't a possible case to be made against Pena Nieto. The problem is political. And López Obrador has been aware of that from day one. And that's hence his attitude of, I'm not going to look into the past. I'm not a man of vengeance, etc., etc. It's his understanding of the situation is a highly political understanding, which is the right understanding of the situation, if you ask me. It's not clear what the right political decision is, because obviously there's both principled and pragmatic arguments in favor of going after Pena Nieto, and there's also principled and pragmatic arguments in favor of not going after Pena Nieto. But governors are not nearly enough. No, they're not nearly enough. And we already have a few of those either behind bars or on the run, and it's clearly not enough. Videgaray might be enough. I mean, he's clearly going to administer he's again adopting a very pragmatic attitude. So he's not going to rush into things. He's going to administer the issue, and depending on how the economy does, how lots of other things work out, he'll begin to, like a killer whale, begin to circle around Pena Nieto. And obviously in that process, a first circle, a very obvious and clear first circle, would be a key player in the past administration. And the obvious one is Videgaray, who again, I suspect a lot of priistas would be happy to sacrifice. If he's concerned about some sort of deal with the priismo at the local level for the elections in 2024, with some sort of pact with the priistas in the Senate and Chamber of Deputies, I'm sure they'd be willing to sacrifice one or two faces from the past without problem.
Thank you, Javier. Our friend Blanca Mariclera Costa asked us, the President of the Supreme Court did try to frame the question in terms of transitional justice. No one else pick it up, discuss. Do you have any reaction to that, Blanca? And also, what is your take on Morena?
Yeah. Well, I agree completely with Marie-Claire. I said it in my previous, what I said before. I was shocked. It was very much, the question was kind of framed in that sense, but nobody really picked it up. And I think it's a pity, because I think it's an important discussion to be had. But in terms of Morena, and in terms of the great image that Javier, like this movie that he showed us right now, towards the end of the sexenio, you have very low growth, you have stable numbers in terms of homicides and violence generally, and you have Peña behind bars. Is that enough? I think in a way it could be enough, it might not be enough, but let me just give it another take. My sense is that anti-oligarchic governments in Latin America in the recent past have been more the victims of success than of failure. The most important being Lula, Bolivia. When you raise enough people out of poverty and they start thinking of themselves as middle class, that kind of a narrative of the poor against the rich does not bode well for anti-oligarchic governments. López Obrador does not have that problem. He does not have economic success as a problem, either because of commodity boom or growth boom, whatever. So just as a question, I mean, as I read it, there is a chance, and we saw it even in the intermediate elections with with horrible economic numbers, with very bad security numbers in terms of violence, and with the pandemic. And despite it all, it didn't do that bad at all. Even its losses in Congress were relatively small, and it did very well in terms of governorships. So there's something about Andres Manuel and his connection with a very large number, millions of Mexicans, that I think might be more resilient than we think. And especially in a context where there might be the risk of having the old guys come back. The old regime, elites, the PRI, the PAN. But I think that Morena, and I will end on this, I think it is true. Morena is obviously, as both Kate and Javier have said, is not a political party in any kind of proper sense of the word. It doesn't, as I said before, have any kind of real operating rules. They don't have rules for managing their conflicts, for deciding who governs them, who their candidates are going to be. And the fact that Andres Manuel López Obrador has played it by his absence is evidence in the sense that he doesn't want, in fact, a strong party. He doesn't, I think Andres Manuel is the kind of leadership that doesn't like to have power centers that are different from him, generally. And this allows him, in terms of Morena, much more freedom of action and makes him the factotum, the cement, the only possible cement to all of those groups of people is Andres Manuel López Obrador. I tend to think with Kate that the fact that despite this lack of basic institutionalization, Morena might do well because of this resilient connection that Andres Manuel continues to have with a very significant portion of the electorate. And that, as I said, in June 6th, we saw that despite pretty terrible results in almost any area, they did quite well.
Thank you, Blanca. Javier just draw us what I would say is the winning scenario for Andres Manuel López Obrador or from Morena party in 2024. Kate, could you help us elaborate the other scenario in which Morena and will not make it in 2024? Is there a way to beat Morena in 2024? What has to happen for that to come true?
I think a couple of things have to happen. I think that that Morena has to implode while trying to select a presidential candidate, and or the opposition will fail to come up with a viable alternative. Elections are held not in abstract, but with respect to individual candidates. And the evaluation of Morena as a party is not what's going to decide who wins the next election. Will López Obrador be willing to cede his place to somebody else within Morena? And if so, will he campaign or will he support, campaign not formally, but will he support Morena's candidate going forward? I think that that's still an open question because of the kind of leadership that Javier has talked about. He never really, he planned to become president. He worked very, very hard to become president. He created the conditions for him to become president. And unless there is some kind of major tectonic shift in the Constitution, that's going to end in 3 years, right? And so it will depend upon what the opposition does and what Morena is able to do in terms of holding together this coalition, which is really somewhat internally diverse in the absence of Andres Manuel. But yes, I think Morena is beatable. I think that I don't actually think that Pena Nieto by himself is enough. I think that AMLO needs to make a case that it's not just Pena Nieto, it's also the PAN and it's also the PRD, that there is some kind of collusion going on there that's broader than just one individual. But I agree with Blanca that it's very fraught to try to go after and peel them off one at a time.
Thank you, Kate. Javier, is there any way you see Morena losing the presidency in 2024?
Yes, I think Kate described the scenario where Morena splinters and, Ebrard, let's say, is not chosen as a candidate and he goes off and tries to become a candidate with Movimiento Ciudadano. So there's serious problems within Morena, whereas the opposition is united, and not only united, but has the right candidate. And it will depend, it's very difficult to say who that right candidate is, but let's assume that one.
Difficult, very difficult.
So they picked the right candidate. Economic problems, the economy doesn't sort of pick up. There's inflation, let's say the inflation scenario right now, and a potential financial crisis that actually happens. So we do get some sort of levels of inflation, and at the end, some sort of financial crisis. AMLO doesn't seem to be terribly keen on the candidate that ends up being Morena's candidate. Let's say it's not Claudia Sheinbaum. I'm assuming that is AMLO's favorite as of today. Let's assume it's not, for some reason, it's not Claudia Sheinbaum, and he gets into a fight with Marcelo Ebrard and he leaves, and Monreal is not picked. So there's serious problems in Morena. So all of those things together. But as both Blanca and Kate have pointed out, still Morena is likely to do quite well. If the sort of ceiling is 53%, and you could win with, let's say, 37%, that's a good 16 points that they can lose and still win. In the way that the PRI won in Mexico City with Del Mazo. After having won with over, I think, 60%, they won again, but they won again with a tiny, by a tiny percentage, with a percentage below 50%. So, I mean, it's a victory, but it's a victory that smells of defeat in terms of where they were 6 years previously. So yes, I can certainly see that scenario. But a lot of things need to happen on Morena's side, over which the opposition has no control. So not only does the opposition have to do everything right, they also have to cross their fingers and hope that Morena does everything wrong. And then again, they have to hope that the economy, violence, etc., stuff over which neither the opposition nor the government has much control over. And let me just point out that when I describe the scenario of Pena Nieto behind bars, I'm not presenting it as necessarily desirable. I think a key victim of these first 3 years and possibly the next 3 years has been rule of law. And it's been a victim on both sides. I think the opposition has used the law politically, and I think López Obrador is also using the law politically, and that's bad news for the rule of law being attacked from both sides, especially given that we have incredibly fragile rule of law. So if López Obrador does go after Peña Nieto for the wrong reasons, and the opposition continues to use the law to oppose López Obrador, by 2024, our rule of law, our Supreme Court, our judicial system is going to be in a very bad shape.
Thank you, Javier. I have a question by Kenneth Coleman, and he's asking us, is there any way that AMLO himself could be in the ballot in 2024? Let me ask you, the three of you this question, and we have 5 minutes to go. And what will be your take, on, Blanca, on these referendums and Mexican democracy? Are referendums strengthening Mexican democracy?
Well, this one certainly didn't. I think, however, that I'm all for representative democracy, in part because I want to be able to, do many things and not just be continually participating in these consultations. But I do think that some figures such as a referendum in relation to critical issues, such as, for instance, do we judge the past or not? How much are we willing to pay in terms of potential stability for justice? I think that's an important question, or certain other crucial issues. Do we want to have private participation in oil and energy generally? Do we want to have, a different educational system? Anyway, or I think they are important, but it was not a very good showing for the first time that this instrument was being used. As to the question of Andres Manuel in the ballot, I've really never seen it. Perhaps I'm blind. I don't see right, but my sense that Andres Manuel is so much in a hurry is inconsistent with the idea of him staying longer. I think we have multiple indications that he is a man in a hurry for a long time. And that gives me a sense that he's very aware of the temporal limits of his mandate and of the temporal limits of his life. And so I really think that he's not, and he knows the workings of the Mexican political system. There's a meta institution in Mexican politics that has, I think, been pivotal for stability over a very long period of time. And that is the 6-year rule and non-re-election for the president. So I'm really not worried that he will want to be in the ballot. So, and that's really my position in relation to that. And in relation to Morena losing, of course, it's a possibility. Everything is a possibility. Most, I would not assign it a big probability at this point. For the reasons that my colleagues have mentioned, I mean, the state of the opposition is not swell. It's unclear to me who a swell candidate could be, one that would really be able to attract all of the anger and dissatisfaction that Andres Manuel has been generating, and that has been growing clearly. But I don't still see who's going to put it together and be able to turn it into votes and become president. I don't see that. And I think that internally, the implosion scenario, I see what you both mentioned, but my sense is that it's going to be his swan song, Andres Manuel, and he has a lot of power. And everybody in there knows it. And the underbelly, or the other side of not having an institutionalized Morena, is that just one of you, or perhaps both, mentioned that if Morena chose someone that Andres Manuel López Obrador didn't like, for me, that is like an impossible scenario. It's like there's no Morena to be choosing, especially the candidate to be president. I mean, that decision is going to be taken by President Andres Manuel López Obrador, in my view. And the fact that everybody knows that, and the fact that his legacy is that pretty formidable power that he's amassed and created in many ways, produced.
Thank you, Blanca. Kate.
May I just add there that I tend to agree that it's unlikely he will be on the ballot, but it is not impossible that what we will see is a Putin-Medvedev type of scenario where he steps back from formal powers of the presidency, but attempts to influence the government from behind the scenes by advising and making public statements. This is not someone who is going to go silent after the presidency is over.
Yes,
many have tried it. Many have tried it, Kate.
Many have tried it. Few
many
have
tried it, and
you have succeeded. I agree. I agree.
Since we haven't had
that may be what he's thinking about right now.
Thank you, Kate. And I will say, since Calles in the late 1920s, early 30s, we haven't had that. Javier, you closed, please.
I also don't see that scenario as a likely scenario, i.e. López Obrador on the ballot. I agree with Blanca. I think he never really seriously contemplated. He might have had dreams about that and fantasies about that, but not seriously contemplated the issue for lots of reasons. And I add, Blanca mentioned some of them. He's a highly historical person. He thinks of himself, his project, his leadership in historical terms and national historical terms. And if there is one huge, great, big taboo in that history, a history that he just is filled with is re-election. That's the difference between Mexico and other Latin American countries where leaders that might be similar to López Obrador sought re-election. They didn't have those taboos. In Mexico, we have that taboo. And I could only see two possible scenarios where that might just happen. One scenario is Mexico grows on average at 10% over the 7 years that he's president. Poverty is reduced to a third of what it was when he became president. Violence disappears, and we're all really, really happy. Who would vote for López Obrador's re-election?
Everybody.
Absolutely everybody. Is that going to happen? No. The other scenario is the complete opposite of that. Total and complete chaos. And I mean, things get really, really bad. I don't mean slight inflation and low growth. I mean, things get really,
Que la boca se te haga chicharrón.
Exactly. I'm going to end by saying that I also don't see that as a likely scenario. But in that scenario, he might become the go-to person to avoid catastrophe on many sides. I also don't see that as a likely scenario. Let me just say something about referendums. I think they're necessary, useful, and inevitable in democracies. And they have become necessary, useful, and inevitable in pretty much every single democracy in the Western world, at least since the 1970s, and have increasingly gained importance in all democracies. Obviously, they must be done right. They have to be done correctly in terms of the issues they address, in terms of the question that is framed, and in terms of the process which they follow from beginning to end. And clearly in Mexico so far, we haven't done a great job in terms of issues, questions, and processes. In terms of issues, maybe a bit more, but certainly question and processes have not been a strong point. Luckily, there's a lot of material, experience, best practices that if we are serious about making referendums a useful tool, we can easily look at all that evidence, all those benchmarks, and have a better go at it next time if there is a next time. And I hope there is a next time. I think it is, as I say, they're necessary, useful, and inevitable.
Thank you, Javier Tello. Thank you, Javier Blanca. Thank you, Kate Brun. This was a fascinating discussion. There's a lot of food for thought here, and I truly appreciate it. And to be continued, this is a fascinating discussion. And thanks a lot. Un abrazo.